Hello again, this is David with Everything Economics, and we're now going to start into part two of three of scientific reasoning. So let's get started. Reliability of scientific reporting. Well, scientists are authorities on science, therefore they are usually trusted with respect to the work. So regardless of what you hear in the media, the internet, most scientists are there's I don't want to say they're supposed to be trusted, but they have spent years and years trying to develop their ideas and to understand whatever their particular study is. And so many times they are usually trusted regarding their work. However, one always has to be cautious about the type of scientist and the research being conducted. So, for example, in this example, chemists are not authorities on geology, nor are inorganic chemists authorities on organic chemistry. So each scientist has their own specialty, their own area of expertise. And so, if you are wanting to understand something about physics, then you are not likely to ask a biologist about that because they could not give you a accurate answer, or at least not a very good answer. All right. Scientific journals are under great pressure, more than daily newspapers, to report the truth. Uh, a scientific journal will lose its reputation and its readers faster when there is an error than in a daily newspaper. So for example, if you hear something in the news or on a newspaper and they make an error, they usually apologize about it. Most of the time, they apologize pretty quickly. Uh, in a scientific journal or an academic journal, many of them are peer-reviewed, which means they have other scientists who review articles before they get published to try to look for any type of mistakes or any type of fault with the article before it's published. So most of the time it's much more stringent, and so there's less likely to be an error because it's gone through a process of review. That's not to say that all scientific journals. There are some who don't, or who are less reputable and don't have very good way of reviewing articles that get submitted for publication. Editors of scientific journals demand that authors provide such good evidence in their articles, but if the article is in a less reputable source, there may be sloppy operational definitions, careless data collection, or inaccurate instruments, or misunderstandings by the reporter or the scientist who's writing it. So you do have to watch out for that sort of thing as far as like reputable versus not very reputable magazines, academic or journal articles. Good evidence. Well, what constitutes as good evidence? Well, in a scientific test or study, the evidence is considered to be good if it is repeatable. In other words, if you conduct a test and you keep getting the similar or the same results, then that usually would suggest that, well, what you're doing or what the evidence shows is pretty good. If you keep getting different results, then either there's something wrong with the test, or maybe what you're testing is not actually the causation. So, so when you're doing scientific tests, you have to repeat again and again and again before you can really confirm that it's actually truth. Example, if a science report states that tigers won't eat vegetables, then this must be tested and repeated using any number of tigers in different locations. So if that's the science report, then you might test tigers at a zoo. You might test tigers in the wild. You might test tigers in different countries even, just to make sure that that statement, tigers won't eat vegetables, would be accurate. Um, if the same results hold true that tigers won't eat vegetables, then that evidence would be considered good evidence. Another thing about science is superstitions. Superstitions, people who are superstitious about some topic are people who hold a belief about what causes what in regard to that topic, despite having good evidence that should convince them their belief is false. So again, we try to get rid of superstition when you're dealing with science. You try to focus on facts and evidence, and you don't appeal to miracles or magic or the supernatural. Uh, an example, the people of China think Americans are silly and superstitious to believe that the number 13 causes bad luck. This is because they know that the real unlucky number is 4. Okay, so here in the United States, a lot of people, or at least many people, say that 13 is bad luck. You know, for example, on a building, you don't have a 13th floor sometimes. Friday the 13th is usually considered bad luck. So that's here in the United States. If you are in China, the number 4 is considered bad luck. So, you know, uh, and the reason for that is because the Chinese word for 4 sounds similar to the Chinese word for death, and that's why it's considered unlucky. Whereas in China, the number 13 just has, it's just a number, doesn't mean anything. All right. Okay, rational versus irrational. A man or woman is rational provided he arrives at, accepts, and revises his beliefs according to the accepted methods of his society. If he or she refuses, keyword refuses to believe, despite good and convincing evidence that has been tested and accepted by the most, the person may be considered irrational. So, example would be flat Earth. So, if you believe the Earth is flat, but then over time you have been shown evidence, measurements, pictures, and so forth showing that the Earth is actually round. Let's see, versus round. If you refuse to believe any of that, then obviously you would be considered irrational. Another example would be the moon landings. Some people have said that the moon landings were fictional, despite pictures being sent back, despite moon rocks being collected from the moon surface, and some people still could say that the moon landings were faked, and so that would be considered irrational. When considering like conspiracy theories, any type of conspiracy theory, a lot of times you're appealing to irrational beliefs, and we can go more into that a little bit later on. But so rational versus irrational. Another example, is it possible I can't talk today. Is it possible for a person to be rational in adopting a superstition if the person isn't in a position to know better? So let me just give you an example. A tribal chief may be rational in his view to sacrifice a virgin to his sun god, but he's still superstitious because his beliefs are absolutely incorrect. In other words, he truly believes and truly knows in his heart that sacrificing a virgin to the sun god is appropriate and rational and normal, but in reality, the belief is superstitious and it's not true. So yes, you can be rational and superstitious at the same time. Occam's razor. According to Occam's razor, if you can have an adequate explanation without assuming some particular exotic entity, such as the hand of fate or devil cats, then don't assume that the exotic entity exists. In simple words, the simplest explanation is often the most likely. So this is it's not a scientific, it's more of a philosophical tool rather than a scientific tool, but it's useful in its sense that, sometimes this the simplest explanation is most likely the true one. And I'll give you an example. Back in the old days, we have the geocentric map. And the geocentric map says the Earth is at the center of the universe, and that the moon, the sun, the planets, they all rotate around the Earth. And you can actually measure this, and scientists did. Ptolemy did, and other ancient scientists. They measured, and they determined that these planets make certain movements while they're revolving around the Earth. And they call these movements epicycles. So in other words, Saturn would move like this, and Mars would move like this, and Venus the same thing, and Mercury the same thing, and so would Jupiter. And the stars would all rotate. And you could, like I said, you could observe this from the Earth. You can see these observations. The theory held out. And then somebody comes along in the 16th century and says, well, maybe the sun is in the center of the universe, or center of the solar system, and that everything revolves around the sun. Well, here you have the sun in the center, and then Mercury, Venus, and the other planets, they all rotate smoothly around the sun. You don't have all these epicycles. You don't have all these extra movements that the planets are making in order to explain your observations. And so the Copernicus model is a simpler model compared to the older model, and therefore, according to Occam's razor, the simplest explanation is usually the correct one. And in this case, the simpler model is correct, as opposed to the ancient model proposed by Ptolemy and other ancient scientists. All right, another example. Here's a question. The electricity in your dormitory suddenly stops working. According to Occam's razor, what is the most likely explanation? So it could be A, there's a ghost from a person who died a long time ago in the building. B, a gang of international terrorists have cut the power. C, an exotic species of bird that eats electrical power lines has started eating the power lines at your dormitory. Or D, there is some kind of maintenance issue that has caused the electricity to go off. Well, if you're a scientist, you're not appealing to ghosts or the supernatural. So definitely not A. A gang of international terrorists have cut the power. It's possible, but it's a very low probability that terrorists are going to be attacking your dormitory. C, an exotic species of bird that eats electrical power lines has started eating the power lines. Animals such as squirrels and perhaps some birds have been known to eat a power line, but an exotic species of bird is highly unlikely. And so we have the simplest explanation, D, which is that most likely there's some kind of maintenance issue. All right, and finally, the duty of the man who investigates the writings of scientists, if learning the truth is his goal, is to make himself an enemy of all that he reads and attack it from every side. He should also suspect himself as he performs his critical examination of it, so that he may avoid falling into either prejudice or leniency. This was written by Alhazen. Basically, what it's saying is that when you are reading about a topic, and it could be a scientific topic or a philosophical topic or any topic, you try to look for any holes in the arguments, any holes in the topic, try to look for faults. You attack it basically as you are reading it. So when you're reading, you're making yourself an enemy. You attack it. You try to find out if there's anything that's wrong with it that you can fault. And of course, if it passes, then then perhaps you have reached a point of truth. All right, so that is the end of part 2, and stay tuned. There'll be a part 3 coming up soon.